So we've all been in the DIY battery forums and seen people post a battery like this and ask whether it's good or not for car audio. They're not very helpful in those forums, and they just give you a no answer without an explanation why or how this could possibly be used. But I'm your boy HifiVega. I do know a thing or two about batteries, so we're gonna test this Power Queen, and then we'll talk about why it may or may not work for you in your system, and what do people mean when they say these are not good for car audio. So without further ado, let's get straight into it.
Yeah, I just want to be the greatest.
First, let's talk about this battery in particular. This is the Power Queen Mini 12.8 volt 100 amp Lifep04 battery. So this is a lithium iron phosphate deep cycle battery. This is the 100 amp hour mini version, meaning it's smaller than the standard 100 amp battery. We're going to compare this to a standard flooded battery and a DIY built Headway Bank, so we can kind of check the performance on it, see what you do and you don't get. With this being the mini version, let's go over the size. First, it does state it in the manual, but you know, I figure you guys like to see it actually measured. So we're at 9 inches, almost perfectly on height. We're right at 5 inches on width, or depth I should say, and then the width of it is right at 10 inches. So this is almost, you know, about 35% smaller than the standard 100 amp hour configuration. But when you open it up, you will get a few things. So you can see I already have these screw terminals on here. You do get a second set of screw terminals in here. It comes with the plastic covers over the terminals. And then you get some caps that you can put on these when the battery is not in use. So let's jump into the manual and we can get a little more information about this battery. So it is Lifep04, nominal voltage 12.8 volts, 100 amp hour rated capacity, and then you can see here it does have a BMS board of 100 amp. So that's the first thing that's going to kind of limit the car audio usage in this is the 100 amp BMS. When you do a DIY battery, you're typically not using a standard BMS or using like an active balancer, which will not limit your discharge. Max discharge current 5 seconds, 250 amps. So 250 amps is pretty decent. That is roughly what you could probably get out of a standard AGM battery, and that's what I would compare this to, a standard AGM battery, not a DIY or a more high performance, high rate discharge battery, which you would typically see in a cardio competition vehicle or just a high drain scenario. All right, so now let's talk about pricing. You can pick this up at regular price for around $350. You can catch it on sale often for $320 or less. Now I'll pop up on screen the alternative, which would be an AGM XS Power D3400. That's going to cost you around $360, but it is a full-size battery at 12 inches by 11 inches by 9 inches. So it's the same height as this, it's wider, it's thicker, and it weighs more than twice as much, probably closer to around 3 times as much as this battery. For this comparison, I think what we'll do is I will use a regular flooded battery, and I will use the Headway Bank that I built that is 64 amp hours, and we'll run it on an amp with one 100 amp power supply that I have on the back side of here, and we'll see what each battery does with a 100 amp quote unquote alternator powering it. Alright, so I want to show you the resting voltage of each battery before we go through the test. They are all 100% charged, and they have been sitting for a couple of days after charge to kind of let them go back down to their natural resting voltage. Before we check this battery, I just wanted to show you that the one 100 amp power supply is set to 14.47 volt. That'll be comparable to what most people charge at in their regular vehicles. All right, the resting voltage of this Power Queen battery is 13.5 volts. This is 100% state of charge, and it has been resting for a few days. All right, let's take a quick peek at the setup here. We've got the NVX ZAD 15 We're gonna run it at 4 ohm. That is rated 1850 watts. We're only starting at 14.4 volts, so this will definitely drag it down with one 100 amp power supply and one 100 amp batteries. We're gonna do this test on the Power Queen. We'll do it on a flooded battery, and we will do it on the Headway 64 amp battery, and we'll compare and contrast the results. Okay, this is the Power Queen. We're gonna run this test at 4 ohm mono 5 different times, and then we'll average out those scores, and we'll do the same for the flooded and for the Headway Bank. Closest to the rated 1850 watts wins. So let's just go ahead and start it. We will take it up to clipping, so you'll see it clip here, and like I said, average out the 5 scores, and then we will see which battery held up the best. $1,672 watts. All right, let's clear this and we will run it back. $1,672 again, dipping to 12.9 volts. We are at 14.4 again. Let's go. $1,691, dipping to 13 volts. Clear again. $1,688, dipping to 12.7 volts. I think for the final time, what I'll do is do it as a burst. So what that means is I know what volume it was clipping at 37 on the deck. I'm gonna leave it at 37, we'll burst it and see if we can get a higher number on our last score, and we'll do this the same way for every single battery. 1634, 12.8 volts. Now I will hook up the other battery and we will run the test the same way on the flooded cell. All right, now let's check the resting voltage on the flooded cell. It's an H8 size battery, so it's a pretty big battery. Weighs roughly 50 pounds, and it's a big hoss compared to the other one. So check the resting voltage. We're at 12.67, so pretty solid for a flooded style battery. Let's hook this up, do the same test we did before. We'll see how the standard flooded battery compares to the Power Queen. All right, we now have the EverStart Max flooded battery H8 size going. We're gonna do the same test. We are gonna run it 5 times, just like we did with the Power Queen. We're gonna track those wattages, and then on the 5th one, we'll do a burst test like we did on Power Queen. We're gonna average them all out, and we'll see who wins the battle. So you can see we're at 14.4 volts. We're set up in amp dyno mode, and we're ready to let it rip. And if I didn't mention before, we are using a 40 hertz test track, so now you know. $1,550 watts, dipping to 12.2 volts. All right, let's run that back again. We're back up to 14.4 volts, so turn it down and go for run number 2. $1,569, dipping to 12.2 volts again. We're back up to 14.4 volts. So let's go again. $15.56 watts, dipping to 12.1. All right, we are ready for our 4th run here. $1,569 watts, dipping to 12.2 volts. Clear that. Now it is time for our burst test. So we're at clipping. We should be at clipping with the volume knob where it is. We'll hit it burst, see if we get more or less power. 1,726 watts, 12.2 volts. Now this is interesting. We got more power on a burst with the flooded battery than the Power Queen. And if I had to guess, that's due to the battery management system on the Power Queen kind of artificially limiting the output. So at burst, the flooded wins. Very interesting. So now I'm going to hook up the Headway and we'll see how that compares to the other two. Now it's time to check the resting voltage of the Headway Bank, and this one is a 64 amp hour bank. I also have a video on how to build this bank. You can check it out at the end of the video. I'll leave it in the end scene credits. So here we go. Let's see where we're sitting at on the Headway. 13.3 volts, almost exactly. So very close to the Power Queen. Let's see how much more power we get out of a high discharge battery versus a battery with a BMS on it. So let's run the same test and see where we end up with the Headway Bank. All right, now we have the Headway Bank hooked up. I definitely expect to see more output with less voltage drop, but really we don't know until we test it. So same 100 amp power supply, same everything. We're gonna do 4 tests. The 5th one a burst, and we'll see how it performs compared to the other 2. With that being said, it's time to let it rip and see what we end up with. (1707 watts). So we're already starting off with a lot higher wattage, which is good. That lets us know that the high discharge rate of the Headway cells is helping over the standard kind of flooded and the standard Power Queen battery, which is a more comparable discharge to a AGM. So let's run it again. Same test. (1696 watts, dropping to 12.3 or 12.5 volts, excuse me. All right, we're gonna let it run one more time. You can hear the power supply kicked on to charge up the bank, but let's let it rip and see where we're at. (1678) dropping to 12.4 volts. I'm sorry, 1678 watts. All right, let's get our 4th run in here. 1713 watts, dropping to 12.6. Now it is time for the burst round, and this is where we'll see how much we gain over the flooded or over the Power Queen with a high discharge rate, higher than anything we've done before. So we should see pretty good results here. I'm expecting, but I could be surprised once we actually run it. So here it goes. We get 1911 watts. So as expected, on a high discharge situation, just a burp, you're gonna get significantly more power out of a high discharge battery, and I don't think that is a secret to anybody. So I'll tear this all down, and then we'll talk about my final thoughts on the Power Queen versus a DIY Headway versus a standard flooded or an AGM battery. I'm back. I have my cue cards. We're ready to go over the results. What I did here was average out the 5 runs. That is 4 runs of up to clipping and then 1 burst run. I also averaged out the voltages. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the worst overall, and that is the flooded cell. We had 4 runs, 1550, 1569, 1556, 1569, and a burst run of 1728. That gave us an average wattage of 1594 watts with an average voltage of 12.34 volts. In second place is the Power Queen. As you can see, the Power Queen had a 1672 watt run twice, then 1691, 1688, and 1634 watts on the burst. That gave us an average of 1671.4 watts with an average voltage of 12.86. And the winner was the Headway Bank. As you can see, we had a run of 1770 watts, 1696, 1678, 1713, and a burst of 1911 watts. That gave us an average of 1741 watts with an average voltage around 12.6 volts. So what does this all mean? We knew that the Headway had a higher discharge capacity, so it's no surprise that it outperformed, especially on the burst test. Now, the interesting part is that the flooded cell outperformed on the burst test. If you want to use the solar style batteries in a vehicle, you need to compare them to an AGM because that's closer to what they are. minus the burst capacity, because obviously the BMS is doing something to limit that burst capacity. Overall, it had a higher consistent voltage than both the Headway and the flooded battery. The wattage was right in the middle, outperformed the flooded battery. It did not perform as well as the Headway battery, which is to be expected. So, can you use these solar style batteries in your vehicle? Yes, you can. There are some advantages, there are some disadvantages. The advantages being it's lighter, it's smaller, it will last much longer, it will discharge much deeper than you could a standard flooded or AGM battery. And like an AGM, you can use it in any configuration. You won't have to stand it straight up and worry about it gassing in your vehicle like you would a flooded battery that you should never run inside a vehicle. The downside of this battery is the BMS, and I think that's why people often don't recommend these in car audio, because it is going to limit you on the output. You do have some benefit with it being more consistent with the voltage. Do I recommend these? Should you buy one of these solar style batteries for in-vehicle? If you do, consider it an AGM replacement. The price is comparable, it's lighter, it will discharge deeper, and it will last much longer. So the choice is up to you. I gave you the information to look at, so do with it what you will. And if you like these kind of nerdy videos, let me know in the comments below. If you're not subscribed, I would love to have you as a subscriber. And stay tuned for more nonsense like this, and I hope to catch every single one of you in the next video. I'd like to thank all my Patreon supporters, but the $6 or more members get a special shout out, and that is 2001 Monolithic, Gene Nava, Joaquin Juarez, El Fuego Audio, Travis McClendon, Brandon Hanna, William Berg, Boxboy Audio Sound Solutions, Jesus Tires, Dennis Cromwell Jr., Scott Dilbeck, D. Stewart, David Kozlik, Scott McCord, Matthew Tolberg, Cornut, Trucker 9000, Bobby Burkett, Kevin Lautner, James Childers, Baba, Thomas Marshall, Living Loud with Andy, Neil Nato, Chris Cogburn, and Old School Stereo. For as little as $2 a month, you can join the Patreon team and get exclusive Patreon-only content, including a monthly Patreon-only hangout stream. It's a really good time. You guys are missing out, and if you want to join, check me out at patreon.com/HifiVega. Oh, 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 oh.